From breakthrough devices to the bottom line, we explore the investment trends, the commercial models, and the strategic thinking required to bring neurotechnology to the global market. This is the Business of Neurotech. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Adam Fraser, and today I'm delighted to welcome David Eagleman to the Business of Neurotech podcast. David is a neuroscientist, best-selling author, podcaster, entrepreneur, and board advisor, a rare combination that puts him at the intersection of cutting-edge brain science and the real world of building and backing companies. He's founded 3 ventures amongst the many other things he does, and we're going to explore it all today. David, a huge welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Adam. It's great to be here with you.
So there is a lot to unpack and a number of directions we can go, and I reserve the right to meander as I tend to do. But what I thought we'd do, David, is just talk through your backstory, do a couple of questions on each of your companies that you founded, which each could be a pod in their own right, but we'll just kind of scratch the surface and then really bring it all together about kind of takeaways and thematics that you've observed in the neurotech space. So how's that sound?
Great. Sounds great.
All right. So kick us off. You do so many things. I touched on some of them in the intro, but just ease the audience in, David. Tell people about your backstory, your career today, and I guess what you're up to today.
Well, so I teach at Stanford University. I used to run a neuroscience laboratory for essentially most of my career, but I gave up the laboratory 10 years ago to do entrepreneurial businesses. And that's what I've been doing ever since. So I show up, teach 3 hours a week, but nowadays I'm off campus doing all my research under the aegis of companies. And on top of that, I do a podcast called Inner Cosmos, which I'm happy to report hit the #1 science podcast in the U.S. And I write books. I've written 8, but I'm now under contract to write my next 2. So I'm both, terrified and excited about that.
You're putting me to shame, David. Like I'm struggling through the grind of one podcast every 2 weeks, and you're juggling a lot of plates there. I mean, how do you think about your own pie chart? Academia, media, writing, and entrepreneurship. Do you have a kind of rule of thumb, or you just kind of roll with whatever's happening in that particular phase?
You know what I do? I actually developed a technique a long time ago, which sounds goofy, but it's worked for me my whole life, which is what I call the lazy Susan method. So you remember on tables back in the old days, they used to have a lazy Susan where you've got the salt and the butter and the pepper and whatever, and you spin it. So you can, anyway. So I've got lots of different projects running at the same time. And what I do is as soon as I start slowing down on something, I spin the thing and I pick up the project that I'm going to be maximally fast at in that moment. And I work on that. And so the advantage is that I'm always working top speed on something. The disadvantage, obviously, is that I'm scattered in, 20 directions. But it seems I haven't died yet, and I'm still not in the, so.
It works for you. It works for you. How do you, we're going to get into your entrepreneurial journey and the companies you founded, but there's a lot we could talk about in terms of the media. You mentioned the Inner Cosmos podcast. You produced and presented The Brain on TV, written books, TED Talks. Clearly your profile and expertise is a huge asset to any business you back, but do investors kind of see the double-edged sword? Oh, it's great. David is such a hugely known figure, but my God, he's got a lot on his plate. How much time does he have to devote to this thing that I'm putting capital into?
Yeah, that's a really insightful question. I do get that question often. So what I'm doing now, I've just kicked off a new company, but for the first time, I'm not CEO. I'm co-founder with my buddy, and he's going to be CEO. And that's exactly the answer that I give when the investor asks me that question. I say, look, I've got the podcast, I've got teaching at Stanford, and so therefore I'm not CEO, but I'm doing a lot of stuff for this.
Right.
Yeah. And I do think it's an advantage that investors see because they know that I have a wide reach for reaching customers. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, one more question on your background, David, then we'll get into each of the companies you've been involved with. I guess before we get into the specifics, it's quite a wide range of sort of niches within neuroscience, neurotech, sensory augmentation, cognitive assessments, now companion robotics. You see a lot in what you do, and I'm sure a lot comes across your desk. I guess before we get into those specifics, how do you determine where to play in this kind of broad field?
That's such a good question. It is true that I see a lot of things, and I see a lot of neuroscience companies that are not doing meaningful things. I mean, just as one look, I mean, some of these are friends of mine or whatever, but there are probably 50 companies out here in the Valley doing stuff with EEG signals, electroencephalography. And, it's a pretty crude signal. And despite a lot of the claims, it's still crude. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff that I wouldn't do. Then there's the really high tech stuff that I'm so excited about. And, I was really excited that Neosensory, for example, my company was able to really pioneer a space. The thing that I'm doing now with companion robotics, which we'll talk about, but that it's funny because it feels different to me because it's not as crazy cutting edge, but I see it as, okay, look, given the convergence of all these technologies, here's an opportunity that I just can't pass up, because one of the things that we care about in neuroscience is, or just as a human even, is the number of elderly people living alone, and 17 million Americans. And what I've seen is people have strokes, people have mild cognitive impairment, people have lots of problems, and they never get diagnosed. I mean, if you don't know what a stroke is, and you have a stroke, you think, oh God, something's weird. I'm going to sleep this off maybe. And, obviously we know time is brain tissue. So anyway, I just figured, God, there's got to be a good solution here. And I feel like we've got one. So that one really pulled at my heartstrings to do that one. But we'll get into the details there.
We'll get into it. Okay, look, nice segue. Let's get into each of the companies. So Neosensory that you referenced there, I think founded in 2015, a 10-year journey. Talk about cutting edge. And we'll get into, was it ahead of its time? Absolutely brilliant vision. But again, just for those that don't know, just ease people into Neosensory's, product offering and what was the thinking?
Yeah, I got really interested as a neuroscientist in this issue of what's called sensory substitution. Essentially, the brain is locked in silence and darkness, and all it ever sees are electrochemical signals. It just sees, spikes running around and so on. And we tend to think about, oh, look, vision is, light going into the brain, and hearing is air compression waves going into the brain and so on. But it's not. Photons get translated into spikes. Air compression waves get translated into spikes. The mixtures of molecules that you pull up in your nose get translated into spikes. And the weird thing is that in the darkness of the skull, that's all that's running around in there. So this got me thinking many years ago about, gosh, could you create a new sense for humans, or could you push information into the brain via an unusual channel? So we started in my lab probably around 2012 or something. We built a vest with vibratory motors all over it, like the buzzers in your cell phone, but many of them, like 32 or 64 of them. And we tried the following experiment. For people who are deaf, and there are about 212 reasons you can go deaf, by the way, genetic reasons. For people who are deaf, could we capture sound and translate the sound into patterns of vibration on the torso? And could deaf people come to hear that way? Because all the inner ear is doing is taking the vibration of the eardrums and breaking that up into different frequencies and shipping that off to the brain along the auditory nerve. So we thought, maybe you could just capture all that same information on your torso, on the skin, and send it up the spinal cord into the brain, and the brain can figure it out. And that's exactly what happened. We were able to demonstrate that people who are deaf can come to hear. Now, the weird part is, of course, we can't know what it is like to hear. But of course, I can't know that with your brain either, nor you mine. We just, anyway, but they're able to, do better and better on these tests and distinguish words and so on. So I gave a talk at the TED conference in 2015. And immediately after, several VCs came up to me and said, we want to fund this as a company. And for me, that was a real moment of a left turn because I had sort of envisioned that I would spend my whole life in academia. But this was a real decision point. And so I ended up saying, okay, look, I'm going to continue to keep one foot in the university, but I'm going to start a company. And so that's what I did for the last 10 years.
Amazing sliding doors moment when those VCs approached you. It's your podcast number 6 of it. It's a new series, David, but Naveen Rao, who was on, talked, he was sort of half joking, half serious about how neurotech and sci-fi are becoming indistinguishable. And I've referenced Star Trek a few times, but that vision you had right there, so cutting edge. And was it ahead of its time, would you say, with hindsight? Like, it's just mind-blowing.
Thank you. I do think so. We had a lot of interest in it. But of course, deafness was our first go-to-market strategy. As it turns out, the deaf market is very small, and it tends to be underemployed, and it tends to be very fractionated in terms of some people who are deaf really want to pick up on the environmental sounds of the world and know if somebody's knocking or honking or whatever. But some people in the deaf community are very opposed to technologies that they see as, hey, somebody's trying to fix me and I'm perfectly happy where I am. So it turns out that it's not really much of a market. So we were looking at all kinds of other things. We ended up doing 72 different experiments in other kinds of senses that you could build for people. Just as one example, my favorite was infrared. So, infrared light is out there. It just happens that our eyes don't have the right machinery to pick up on it. And so it's totally invisible to us. But boy, it is a really, full, rich signal out there. And so I hooked up some what are called bolometers, which pick up on infrared, and translated that into patterns of vibration on my wrist, and was able to pick up infrared. And that was so cool. Just as one example, there are actually different ranges of infrared you can pick up on, but one of them was mid-range, which is temperature. I was wearing this, and I walked into the library and I could feel which cars had been parked there for a while versus which ones had parked there in the last 20 minutes or so, because the engine block was hot. I could just immediately feel that as I was walking by. Then I got in the library and there were 2 empty chairs, and I could feel which one had been sat in the last 20, 30 minutes because it was still warmer than the other one. I could even tell on the shelf there were some books that were laid out for picking up, and I could tell which books had been picked up recently because they retain a heat signature for a little while. So I was really amazed at the kind of way that you could see time differently. You could slice time differently with this. In answer to your question of whether it was ahead of its time, as I said, we did 72 different experiments that were so cool, but it was actually quite difficult to find a market for it, like a meaningful market. And so, so happily I was able to sell the company last year. It was not a great big sale, but it was enough. We got the IP sold,
sure.
and that means it will live on. If the acquiring company does, I don't actually know if they're going to sit on it forever, if they're going to move on it right away. So we'll see. But yeah, it does feel weird because it feels like if there had been more people who were willing to say, look, I want to take something on and there's no particular purpose to it. I want to see infrared light, not because it's going to make me better at my job, but because this is the awe of the cosmos we live in. That would have been great, but it's hard to make a market out of that.
It's so interesting, David, the way you tell the story. I almost jumped to the brain as just one big data processing unit. We think of these, sight and sound and touch in different ways, but ultimately it's just a signal. And then my mind jumps. I don't want to artificially bring BCI into every single conversation, but it comes up all the time. But in essence, now the tech has advanced. Fast forward 10 years. Let's put a chip in the brain in very simple terms, read, write, edit, plasticity. You were just taking a different kind of mechanism or channel, touch. I sort of see similarities, just the medium has now morphed to BCI, and maybe is a chip the logical way to do this, not via the senses, or do you do both? Can you do both?
It's such a good question. So while I was running Neosensory, my wife was working at Neuralink, and she's a neuroscientist also. And we always had these conversations about non-invasive BCI, which is what I was doing, versus invasive BCI. Sure. And the fact is, I think Neuralink is doing such an amazing job. And they're just doing such a wonderful thing at shrinking the technology and making it robotically controlled and avoiding blood vessels, all that stuff. But it is still an open head surgery. And I think there's this mythology around BCI, which is, wow, everyone's going to get this in 10 years where, I want to interface with my cell phone faster. And so I'm going to get an open head surgery. I don't see it. And I'm happy to be on the record now. And maybe I'll look back in 10 years and laugh at my naivete. But I feel like if you can buy for a few $100 something that sits on your wrist and passes information in that way, sure, most people are probably going to prefer that over a surgery where there's always risk of infection and death on the table.
Sure. Okay, let's shift gears to BrainCheck. And there's obviously a crossover period that I think started 2016.
BrainCheck started before Neosensory, actually.
Oh, is it before? Okay, so again, getting into SaaS platform, I guess, assessments. Talk us through BrainCheck and what it was all about.
BrainCheck I started probably around 2010, and that was very simple. I was doing a lot of psychophysics works in my lab, which is you sit someone down in front of a computer and you're showing something on the screen and you're asking them what they're perceiving. And I have papers in Science and Nature and other papers that are purely psychophysics experiments because you can tell so much. It's such a wonderful electrode into how the brain must be working if you can see what people perceive based on what you're showing. Okay. But I realized with all the neuropsychology tests, which are, let's say seeing how you're doing cognitively, those were paper and pencil up until that time. And so I was just doing something very simple, which is just digitizing these, which actually makes them slightly better because you can, first of all, randomize everything, but also you have millisecond resolution on how people are doing. So we digitized those, and I went direct to consumer on that and B2B at the same time. And it turns out the direct to consumer, we still have an app on the market. This is 16 years later, and that's great, but that never really caught on because I think everyone says they kind of want to know how they're doing cognitively and they want to establish a baseline. But in fact, first of all, there's a million reasons why we're all lazy about actually going and doing the work and downloading the app and testing, even though it's like 6 minutes and you're just playing some games. The whole key is that you're just playing these fun games. And then at the end, I'm measuring 14 different things happening under the hood in terms of perception, cognition, decision-making, and so on. But what did work very well was the B2B. So we're in lots of major hospital systems and physician practices. And I think the reason there is just because it's reimbursable to do cognitive tests for the physicians. So they hand someone the tablet, the person takes the tests. Every year when the person visits, they establish this baseline and the physician get reimbursed for it. So that worked very well, so well that this company is still rolling strong 16 years later and presumably will be into the future.
Great. It's exploded the sort of wellness space. You're much closer to this niche than me, but in terms of moats, was the first mover just a big thing, establishing the relationships with some major clinical practices? And once you're embedded in workflow, that's half the battle.
I think that's exactly right. We also put a lot of effort, just like Apple computers, into making it really nice and a good experience. But yeah, I do think it helped just being the first ones to do that. And what we quickly established and have continued to have is the largest database of tests, of data points, of hundreds of thousands of people of all different ages and conditions and so on. And each new data point that we get just helps us that much more in terms of being able to say, this is where you should be for your age range. This is where there's a problem. This is where there's not a problem, so on. So once you've established yourself in the territory and collected the data, that's what gives you the moat. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Now the data becomes a key asset. And gets harder and harder for someone new to come in when you've got this weight of numbers and all the analytics you can do, benchmarking and so forth. And do you remain exec in BrainCheck, David, or have you moved to a kind of advisory role?
Not. No, starting about 6 years ago, the company, went on with it because with Neosensory and the other projects that I'm doing, I just couldn't do a good job with them all.
Okay, great. Look, again, each of these companies would be a pod in their own right, but I just want to get to Jojo Health and then kind of pull it all together. So your latest venture, companion robotics, very exciting, a complete, again, 3 very different plays, but tell us about the backstory to Jojo Health.
Yeah. So here's the thing. One thing that's very clear to anybody who's looking around at the community of our elders who are, let's say, past retirement age, there's a lot of loneliness, a lot of depression, and a lot of people living alone. And so I was very interested in, could we ride this wave of AI to really make companion robotics that are worth it? So here's what we discovered at the beginning, at the outset, was that with a lot of customer research, is that a lot of elderly people do not want something that you have to recharge the batteries. They don't want something with an app. So what we did is we made a stationary robot that you just plug in. You just plug it in. You don't have to do anything. It's going. And what Jojo does, there's no camera because the demographic does not want a camera. They want to be able to walk around in their underwear. But there's a little, what's called a PIR sensor. This is just detecting motion. So Jojo detects when you've walked in the room. It's very clever about making sure, that you're not having some other conversation or whatever. It's not outside of normal hours. But anyway, when she detects you walked in the room, she starts talking to you. She says, hey, let's pick up on that conversation where we were earlier. When is your grandson coming to visit? And blah, blah, blah. And so the key is it keeps people socially and cognitively engaged. And the key is that Jojo asks people all about their life. And of course, like any good LLM, remembers everything. And so she's able to really hold the context and ask you about things. This kind of engagement is massively important for people who live alone. As I said, there are 17 million of them just in this country. Okay, so that's one part. That's half of what Jojo does. But the other half is all the medical stuff that she's doing under the hood. So we're doing very sophisticated vocal biomarkers and also conversational biomarkers. So that means we're looking at the exact, pitch and pauses and the details of how the words sound. And conversational biomarkers means, the richness of the vocabulary, for example, and the words that are chosen for things. Anyway, we're doing all this analysis on everything that ever gets said. And with that, we actually get a very strong window into cognitive decline. Now, my expertise on this came from BrainCheck, since 2010. Right. So I've had lots and lots of practice with that world. And so what we're doing now is, instead of having people take a test on a tablet, we're testing for decline by listening to people's voices while they're having a conversation with you. And so there's that. I've also just recently patented a method for detecting stroke within about 20 seconds. And the reason this matters so much, as we said, is just because, often people have a stroke and they don't know what's happened, either because they don't know anything about strokes in general, or because in the context of having the stroke, they are confused. And so anyway, what Jojo does is she detects that a stroke has been had and immediately sends off SMS text messages to the emergency contacts and says, hey, so for FDA reasons, we can't diagnose a stroke, but what we can do is send off a message saying, hey, there seems to be a concern with the language here. Here's a 3-second recording of the language when I asked the person to repeat this sentence. And, please note this and check it out if you think there's a problem. So half of Jojo is keeping people socially and cognitively active, and half of Jojo is medical monitoring. And I think it's that combination where the secret is. Yeah.
Absolutely amazing. Like so many neurotech startups, like I was saying, can be commercially very successful, but it's also such a purpose-led, meaningful business to be in. Do you even go beyond to pure utility, like schedule my appointments, remind me when it's my grandchild's birthday, or is that down the track?
Exactly. I mean, one of the first things is, reminding of medications, because it turns out that's really important. So hey, it's 5 p.m., take your Xarelto or whatever. So we remind medications. Another thing is, there's so much you can do with voice. So, if you fall down, you say, hey, Jojo, I've fallen down, help. And, and then Jojo says, you want me to contact your emergency contacts, and pops out an email. So there's a million things like that. But yes, it can help you with all that. There's one other thing that I think is very important, which is we really care about human social contact also. So one of the things Jojo does is constantly try to get you to do that, and says, hey, it's been 2 weeks since you've seen your friend Marjorie. Why don't you call Marjorie? Hey, when's the last time you checked in on your grandson? And so on. And constantly trying to really enhance real human contact.
Amazing. And is that at seed stage? Where have you launched yet? Where's that at?
We are pre-seed. We have bootstrapped everything. We've already built the robot, and we're in homes. We're in a bunch of homes testing and getting rapid feedback. Yeah.
Amazing.
And we're going to raise in about, a month or two.
Okay. Yeah. I look forward to seeing how that plays out. Amazing vision. All right, David, thank you. Let's try and pull those thematics together. You've got a decade plus across 3 entrepreneurial neurotech ventures. Are there any common, what are the sort of headline commercial, are they too different to bring out common commercial challenges, or are there any sort of headlines about working in kind of neuroscience, neurotech that you take away at a headline level?
That's a really interesting question. What they have in common is going around to VCs and doing the pitch and whatever. And I have been through so many rounds of that now. I'm an expert in some sense, but I hate it. I mean, the reason is, no matter what your product is, you're only going to find 1 in 50 people, or maybe less, that jive with it and care and say, ooh, that's just right for me. And so you end up wasting so much time. So my new strategy, I'm trying to implement this. I'm naturally a very nice person, but what I'm trying to implement is, if I can see that a VC meeting is not going anywhere, saying, hey, you know what, let's both save time. I don't think it's going anywhere. Let's just leave after 15 minutes instead of an hour. Right. So I think everybody's appreciative of that sort of thing. It's just socially awkward. But anyway, so that's what they have in common. But let's see, what else do they have in common? I mean, I've learned a lot about FDA, which, it's different in each country. But, I have really mixed feelings about the FDA. I feel like on the one hand, their mission is so important, and I'm glad they're doing it. And on the other hand, it, like many organizations, gets filled with bureaucrats who just want to do bureaucratic stuff. And the last guy I talked to said, I was sort of pushing him a little bit back and forth, and he said, look, if I could go back and regulate aspirin, I would do that. Because this was for something we were developing for tinnitus. And he said, no way, you have to get this regulated with the FDA and all this. Why? Because what if somebody has tinnitus, but it represents a deeper problem? And so that's when I said to him, I said, yes, but what if somebody has a headache and takes an aspirin, but it actually represents a deeper problem? And he said, I would regulate aspirin if I could, but I was too late for that one. And I just felt like, wow, there's a lot of, here's a guy holding a hammer and everything looks like a nail to him. So anyway, whatever. I've learned a lot about FDA, and I'm getting smarter at it. Yeah.
Let's take each of those in order. So on the funding side, it's interesting the way you frame it, David, because I've been at Omniscient 5 years, and we faced a similar thing. Connectivics was so new, no one had a thesis by definition. And we're the first mover, we're the first to take it out of the lab into the market. And VC, every single homepage website says, we're looking for disruptive entrepreneurs that, will change the landscape and think differently. But the reality is like, oh, what's connectivics? I've got to do a lot of work to unpack a brand new field. It's a friction point. So it's hard bringing something truly innovative and disruptive to Silicon Valley. And it sounds like you've had the same experience, which seems counterintuitive. That is what they claim they want, but it's not easy.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Every VC has that on their webpage, and in fact, they're just looking for the next, Uber for ice cream or whatever the thing is. So that's it is a challenge, and there are VCs. Happily, I've come to know them over the years. There are VCs who really care about something big and new, but it's not everyone.
Do you feel you've raised money from a whole spectrum of investors, like high net worth family offices are more suited to Neurotech seed because they can buy into kind of the mission, the purpose, the legacy? Have you found that when people just hook into the story, they go, like the founder team, like the vision, don't worry about the DCF and the IRR analysis, I'm in?
That gives me a good idea. The answer is I have not gone to family offices at all, ever. Right. But that might be, when I'm raising in a month or two, that might be a smarter idea to start there and try that as well. I've always gone VC, and as a result, I have no basis for comparison in terms of whether there are pros and cons going other directions. I mean, I have some friends who are doing a company where they're just raising angel, and they've raised 3 big rounds on safe notes now. I mean, like a lot of money coming in, but they're they don't want to give up any control. And so they're not taking on any board members, not doing a priced round. It's a fascinating strategy. It seems to be working. Yeah.
Yeah. And look, on the FDA topic, again, in your 3 businesses, you've gone wellness unregulated, then you've obviously done 510K regulated. I look at Whoop and Aura, and I even, Calm, the meditation app. There is so much capital flowing into, I'm doing the air quotes, wellness. Great businesses. I'm all in, but the lines seem to be getting blurred of when is a wellness device becoming a medical device, and what's your kind of thinking on that shade of gray in the middle? Because I think with Jojo, you're pushing up against those boundaries as well.
That's exactly right. And what I would like to do ideally is be really careful and stay just on the side of the line where we don't need FDA clearance, but where we're, decision support, as it's called, clinical decision support, where we're saying, look, we're not saying the word stroke, but we are saying this person is now producing a word salad, and we have a little recording of this person trying to repeat a sentence and saying a word salad. This is what happens for the listeners when you get middle cerebral artery blockade on your left side. You get what's called an aphasia, where you're not producing language correctly. So what I'm hoping is that we can say, hey, we noted there's something about the language here that you might want to pay attention to, and then we don't have to go through 18 months of FDA stuff. But we'll see. We'll see how that goes. I don't know.
How have you found let's sort of hone in on your personal journey. Clearly, deep subject matter expertise in neuroscience and the areas, you're teaching at Stanford, you've written books on topics. Doesn't naturally follow that you'd be a great business person, but you're clearly also a very entrepreneurial thinker. That's come through even just in this conversation. But how has that journey been? Were you always naturally quite good with, numbers? Have you done an MBA, or have you brought in co-founders that kind of supplement areas where maybe you're not as expert?
That's a great question. Now, in some sense, I'm a terrible business guy. I'm the last guy that should ever have been there. It's just that having run a lab for my whole adult life, I realized the limitation. Actually, I hadn't even realized the extent of the limitations, by which I mean, there were several things that I built in the lab over the years, and I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. That's pretty close to being ready for, it could make a leap over to commercial. But it wasn't until I really built hardware in Neosensory and had a whole hardware team that I learned how distant one's little lab hack together stuff is from being a final product. I had no idea how many steps there were there. And so with Jojo Robotics, my co-founder, Harris Romanoff, has built a beautiful robot, which he's assembled from pieces and parts from all over the place, and it works really well. But we just had a conversation the other day where he explained to me it's from here a 9-month process at minimum to do, to actually source this right and do the right tooling and do the blah, blah, blah. Even though I thought we were so cleverly piecing everything together, design for manufacturers, a whole world in itself. So, happily there are people. The one thing I can do is bring together people who have expertise where I don't. And so, I've learned a lot, and I know to just hand over the reins to those people on those projects. Yeah, no, but I was never a business guy. No one in my family was ever a business person. I didn't know anything about it. But I did see so many examples, though, where things were happening in the laboratory that could help the world in a real way if they were products. And I guess I knew I had to make that leap at some point and learn that world. So what I feel like now is that I have one foot in both worlds, on the academic campus and in the entrepreneurial world. And for the first time in my life, I see the walls of the fishbowl on both of those, which I didn't see originally on either of those. I thought academia, you could do anything. And I also thought in business, you could do anything. And now I see where the limits are. And that's why I keep a foot in both, because it's sometimes quite useful.
Yeah. Sort of uniquely placed to answer this question, David. If there's any aspiring founders listening, maybe they're doing a postdoctorate, maybe they're doing some research, they're like, oh my God, this could be a huge TAM. Is it for everyone? Like what are the gates they should think about? What should their decision tree look like before they take a leap into the unknown and try and raise some capital and build a business?
Cool. I think the important parts are making sure that you have people around you who have done it before, who've seen this movie before, because what happens, I around here in Silicon Valley, I see a million young founders and they're all awesome and full of energy, but they're making all the same mistakes that one always makes. And so having graybeards around makes a lot of sense. Number one, is it for everybody? I actually think, here's my take on it nowadays is a life in academia is stressful because you're always doing grants and you're always having to fight for the next thing. But in a sense, it's pretty easy. Like it's a much easier life than a life in the entrepreneurial world, which is really hard. And you can really fail and you can really lose other people millions of their dollars. And you can, lose your employees' jobs. And it's a really much higher stakes there. So I don't think it's for everybody. I think some people would be better off just being comfortable in an academic lab. That said, for anyone who wants to try it, I think it is really cool and worthwhile to try it. And, the one lesson I've learned is I'm not sure how to cast this yet. And I don't know if this is always right, but what I have noticed is the best entrepreneurs that I've met, they'll try something, they'll give it their all, they'll give 110%, and they'll do it for a few years. And if it's not working, if it's not taking off, they'll say, okay, we're shutting this down, we're returning whatever investor money is left. And the investor's like, okay, that's cool. It was a gamble, and thanks for trying your hardest and done. But I will say that I personally did not do that. With Neosensory, I ran the company probably for much longer than made sense. And the reason I was doing it is because I felt so guilty that people had put in real money, and I wanted to fight to the death to save their money, to make something worthwhile. And in retrospect, I think that was not the right thing to do. So now I'm a little smarter about it. Anyway, so that's what I would recommend to an aspiring young person is give it your all and just live and breathe that thing for 2 or 3 years. And if it looks like it's going well, then keep going and maybe hire on a new CEO or whatever. But and if not, just wrap it up.
Definitely can vouch for it's hard running a startup. It seems very glamorous from the outside. And look, there is a lot to love about running a tech disruptive startup. It's exciting, but one of Musk's many quotes on life in startup land, it's, all the worst problems come to your desk, and it's like being, punched in the face repeatedly, 10 times a week. There is some glamour, but there's a lot of grind behind the scenes, isn't there?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that's why, that's why it's so worthwhile though, because when you get to, get up on a stage in front of people, when you get to get away from the face punching for 1 hour and you get up on a stage and you say, you know what, we've actually accomplished some stuff. We actually have built this thing that's on the market. And for example, deaf people all over the world are wearing this on their wrist. That's cool. Like that feels like, that was worth it. I'm glad I did that.
That is cool. It's funny you say that because even compared to yourself, I do some limited public speaking, but it's very re-energizing to tell like the omniscient story in my case and see that first for the people that have never heard of brain mapping or connectomics or the potential and the lean forward and the eyes light up. And it's like, this reminds me why I deal with the other 70 hours a week of grind, because we are doing something pretty magical here. And it's just, the journey.
Yes.
David, I want to be respectful of your time. Final question. Let's just put your wet towel on the head, look forward the next 5-10 years. There's so much exciting stuff happening in neurotech. You're at the center of a lot of it. We mentioned BCI. There's a ton of capital flowing in well beyond Neuralink now. Every week I seem to read about another 100 million plus BCI raise. Where do you see the neurotech sector going? I mean, do you feel we are where we should be? Is it ahead of where, are you, as a kind of founding member of this space, are you proud of where we've got to, and where do you see it going from here?
I think it's so exciting what's happening. So first of all, the space started, like in the 1960s with people dunking electrodes in the brain. So it's just been a long slog of a thing for a very long time. And neurosurgeons have been doing this. And then, BlackRock came along with an electrode array. You could stick in, like 8x8 electrodes. And then Neuralink is here. Lots of companies, and they're sewing in, instead of a big metal electrode, they're sewing these very fine threads and so on. But there are two other really exciting things happening that represent the future of the field. One of them is a company called Science, run by Max Hodak, who was at Neuralink. And that is, they're doing some very practical stuff that they know works, but their sort of dream project is, instead of using a metal electrode into the brain, you actually grow cells into the brain. So you take cells from the person, you engineer them genetically. Well, first of all, you use, you reverse them to stem cells, you grow them up as neurons, and you genetically engineer those neurons so that they are, controllable by light and they respond with light. Okay. So what you do is you take these neurons from the person, you put them on the outside of the brain, and they grow into the brain, the axon and the dendrites.
Wow.
And now what you can do is, with light, you can control these neurons to actually activate neurons in the brain. And you can also read what's happening in the brain by these neurons popping off. So this is what they call a biohybrid electrode. Instead of a metal electrode, you're just using cells. Wow. And so I think that is infinitely cool. And I absolutely love what they're doing. The other company I'd shout out is a company called Subsense, which is doing nanoparticles. Now, nanoparticles has been something that people have talked about this for a while, but Subsense is the first company that I know that's really, really grinding on this and trying to make this work. And what they're doing is you put lots of these very super, super tiny particles into the brain. And the idea is that they can detect when cells fire because they float around and they live in the space between cells. Or in other cases, you make it so that you can actually activate the cell. So there's two flavors of particles that you're dealing with. Some you can use to activate a cell, some you use to read when a cell is active. But this is, I think, the real future of BCI, because the idea of drilling holes in the skull and having to stick in electrodes, whether metal or cell, still requires an open-head surgery. And this, in theory, does not. If you can, eventually someday swallow a capsule with 100 billion little nano robots in it, and they go around, and then you can read and write to the brain that way.
Amazing. What a great way to wrap the conversation, David. Such an exciting sector to be part of. Thank you very much for joining the Business of Neurotech podcast. Before I let you go, where do you want to send people that may want to follow what you're doing online and learn more about your work?
I would just say listen to the Inner Cosmos podcast. So eagleman.com/podcast is one place you can find it. You can get it on any place, but that's where I talk about all of these topics and many more.
Excellent. Thank you so much, David. It's been great hosting you.
Great. Thanks, Adam. Great to be here.
Thanks for listening to the show. For more information on the podcast, individual show notes and all the links about where you can find the show, please visit businessofneurotech.com. We look forward to seeing you on a future episode.